This photograph has puzzled experts for decades. Dr. Harry Morris is a facial recognition specialist who applied modern technology to this image. That's when the real mystery emerged. The image shows a group of women from the Women's Land Army parading through the streets of New York City during World War I, promoting their vital role in farming while men were at war. But there's something impossible about this image that defies everything we know about time, space, and death itself. Dr. Harry Morris, a facial recognition expert at State University, made a discovery that nobody expected. Using advanced computer analysis, he found that one woman in this parade appears in 17 different photographs taken across the country during the same year. The woman appears to be working at the same time in Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, and 5 other states, all documented within the same 6-week period. The mathematics are staggering. In 1917, traveling between these locations would have required at least 6 weeks of constant movement by train and wagon. Yet the photographs show her actively working in fields that were over 1,000 miles apart, sometimes on the very same day, according to the documentation stamps on the images. Professor Sarah Walsh, a genealogical researcher at the Women's Land Army Research Foundation, decided to investigate the woman's identity. What she found was even more disturbing. The woman driving the wagon in this New York City parade is Raney O'Brien, a 23-year-old factory worker from Chicago. But according to official records, Raney O'Brien had been dead for 2 years when this photograph was taken. The death certificate is clear and unambiguous. Raney O'Brien lost her life in a factory accident at the Triangle Textile Mill in Chicago on March 15, 1915. The accident was witnessed by dozens of workers and documented by city officials. Her body was identified by her supervisor and buried in Graceland Cemetery 3 days later. Yet here she is, apparently alive and driving a wagon through the streets of New York in this parade, 2 full years after her documented death. The implications are staggering. Either the death records are completely wrong, or someone has been using a dead woman's identity to infiltrate the Women's Land Army program on a massive scale. Dr. Morris's facial recognition analysis leaves no room for doubt. The bone structure, eye spacing, and facial proportions are identical between the woman in the New York parade and all 17 photographs from different states. This isn't a case of mistaken identity or similar-looking women. The computer analysis shows a 99.7% probability that all the photographs show the same person. The geographic spread is equally impossible to explain. The documented locations stretch from dairy farms in Vermont to wheat fields in Kansas, from apple orchards in Washington to cotton fields in Georgia. No single person could have traveled between these locations in the time frames documented, even with the most efficient transportation available in 1917. What makes this case even more mysterious is how she managed to participate in the New York City parade while simultaneously appearing in farm work photographs across multiple states. The timing suggests she would have needed to travel from New York to distant farms and back within days, an impossible feat given 1917 transportation limitations. The initial theory among researchers was that someone had created a massive identity theft network. Perhaps criminals had stolen Raney O'Brien's identity and distributed it to multiple women working in the Women's Land Army program. But this explanation raises even more questions. How would such a network operate across state lines in 1917? Who would have the resources and motivation to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme? This discovery has left historians confused and asking new questions. If one woman can appear in a New York City parade while working in multiple farm locations at the same time, and while officially dead, what other impossible stories might be hiding in our historical records? Dr. Robert Chen, an industrial historian at the Chicago Archives, took on the challenge of investigating the original factory accident that supposedly claimed Raney O'Brien's life. His research would reveal a compelling theory that seemed to explain the impossible woman mystery. The Triangle Textile Mill accident on March 15, 1915, was one of several industrial disasters that plagued Chicago during that era. Dr. Chen discovered that the factory was a dangerous workplace, with poor safety conditions and inadequate fire prevention measures. The accident occurred during the night shift, when a boiler explosion caused a fire that spread rapidly through the building. Raney O'Brien was one of 12 workers present during the explosion. According to witness statements collected by Dr. Chen, the fire was intense and the building filled with smoke within minutes. Workers had to escape through narrow stairwells, and several people were trapped on the upper floors when the main staircase collapsed. The factory supervisor, Thomas McKenzie, provided crucial testimony about the identification of victims. In his statement to police, McKenzie said that Raney O'Brien's body was too badly burned to identify with certainty. This detail caught Dr. Chen's attention immediately. If the body was too burned to identify, how could officials be certain it was Raney O'Brien? Dr. Chen's investigation revealed that the identification was based primarily on the location where the body was found and the fact that Raney O'Brien was unaccounted for after the accident. No dental records were used for identification, and fingerprinting was not yet a standard practice in 1915. The identification was essentially an educated guess based on circumstantial evidence. This discovery opened up an entirely new possibility. What if Raney O'Brien had actually escaped the factory fire, but allowed officials to believe she had died? Dr. Chen found that Raney had accumulated significant debts before the accident. She owed money to several creditors and was facing potential legal action from a landlord who claimed she had damaged his property. Document examiner Dr. Lisa Park analyzed the Women's Land Army recruitment records and found several suspicious elements. Raney O'Brien's application was filled out in handwriting that showed signs of careful practice, as if someone was trying to perfect a signature. The dates on several documents appeared to have been altered, and the ink chemistry was inconsistent with the supposed creation dates. Dr. Park's analysis revealed that Raney's Women's Land Army application had been submitted using a birth certificate that was likely forged. The document showed signs of chemical alteration, and the paper was newer than it should have been for a certificate supposedly issued in 1894. The economic motivation for such an elaborate deception became clear through Dr. Chen's research. Raney O'Brien was the sole provider for 3 younger sisters after their parents died in 1913. The Women's Land Army program offered better wages than factory work, along with housing and meals. For someone desperate to escape debt and provide for family members, faking death and assuming a new identity might have seemed like the only option. Dr. Chen discovered that the Women's Land Army had recruitment offices in major cities across the country. A clever person could have applied to multiple offices using the same identity, knowing that communication between offices was slow and unreliable in 1917. This would explain how Raney O'Brien could appear to be working in multiple locations simultaneously. The transportation puzzle also began to make sense. The Women's Land Army had access to military transport vehicles and priority scheduling on railroad lines. Workers were regularly moved between locations based on seasonal needs and crop schedules. Someone with inside knowledge of the system could have arranged to travel between locations much faster than civilian transportation would allow. Dr. Chen's theory painted a picture of a desperate young woman who made an extraordinary choice. Faced with overwhelming debt and responsibility for her sisters, Raney O'Brien may have seen the factory fire as an opportunity to disappear and start over. She could have escaped during the chaos, allowed officials to assume she had died, and then used forged documents to join the Women's Land Army under multiple identities. The scheme would have required careful planning and considerable courage. Raney would have needed to create false documents, learn agricultural skills quickly, and maintain multiple identities across vast distances. But the rewards would have been substantial: steady income, housing, and the chance to contribute to the war effort while escaping her previous life. Professor Sarah Walsh found additional evidence supporting this theory. Records showed that money began arriving regularly at the Chicago orphanage where Raney's sisters were living, starting in late 1915. The payments came from different sources across the country, but always in amounts that matched Women's Land Army wages. The case appeared solved. Raney O'Brien had faked her death in the factory fire and assumed multiple identities to work in the Women's Land Army program. It was an elaborate but understandable response to desperate circumstances. The impossible woman was simply a clever woman who had found a way to be in multiple places at once through careful planning and forged documents. Dr. Amanda Torres, a forensic genealogist at the National Military Records Office, decided to use DNA analysis to confirm the theory that Raney O'Brien had faked her death. Her findings would completely destroy the carefully constructed explanation and send the investigation in a shocking new direction. Dr. Torres obtained hair samples from Raney O'Brien's living descendants, including her great-niece who still lived in Chicago. The family had preserved several personal items from Raney, including a hairbrush and clothing that contained DNA material. Dr. Torres also requested access to remains from the Triangle Textile Mill accident that had been preserved in the Chicago Medical Examiner's office. The DNA analysis took several weeks to complete, but the results were clear and completely destroyed the fake death theory. The DNA from Raney O'Brien's descendants matched perfectly with the remains from the factory accident. Raney O'Brien had indeed died in the fire on March 15, 1915, exactly as the official records stated. This confirmation meant that everything Dr. Chen and his colleagues had theorized was impossible. Raney O'Brien could not have faked her death because she had actually died. The woman appearing in 17 different photographs across the country in 1917 was someone else entirely, someone who had somehow assumed Raney's identity after her death. Dr. Torres made another disturbing discovery while reviewing the Women's Land Army photographs. The mysterious woman didn't just appear in farm fields and rural settings. She also appeared in official government buildings, standing next to military officers and bureaucrats who were overseeing the Women's Land Army program. In one photograph, she's standing in the lobby of the Department of Agriculture building in Washington, D.C., wearing civilian clothes and carrying official-looking documents. In another, she's seated at a desk in what appears to be a military planning room, surrounded by maps and strategic documents that would have been classified during wartime. Most shocking of all, Dr. Torres found that the woman appeared in official Women's Land Army promotional materials that were distributed to recruit more volunteers. Her face was used on posters and in newspaper advertisements encouraging women to join the program. The government was not only aware of this woman's existence, but was actively promoting her as a symbol of the Women's Land Army. Professor Sarah Walsh, who had originally identified Raney O'Brien, was forced to confront the collapse of her theory. The DNA evidence was unquestionable. Raney O'Brien had died in 1915, yet someone who looked exactly like her was working for the government in 1917. The implications were disturbing and suggested something far more sinister than simple identity fraud. Dr. Harry Morris's facial recognition analysis had been completely accurate. The same woman appeared in all 17 photographs, but she was not Raney O'Brien. Someone had deliberately chosen to use a dead woman's identity for purposes that went far beyond simple economic necessity. The investigation now faced a terrifying question. Who was this woman, and why was the government using a dead person's identity to place her in sensitive positions throughout the Women's Land Army program? The official nature of her appearances suggested that this was not a case of individual fraud, but an organized operation with government backing. Dr. Torres discovered that similar cases were appearing in other historical records. Women with impossible travel schedules and multiple simultaneous appearances were documented in various government programs during World War I. The pattern suggested that the mysterious woman was not an isolated case but part of a larger system. The experts involved in the investigation began to realize that they were dealing with something that challenged their understanding of how government operated during wartime. The careful documentation of this woman's activities suggested that her multiple appearances were not accidental but deliberate. The promotional materials featuring the mysterious woman were particularly troubling. The government had chosen to use her image to encourage other women to join the Women's Land Army, suggesting that her activities were considered praiseworthy and patriotic. But if she was using a dead woman's identity, what exactly was she doing that warranted such recognition? Dr. Torres's DNA analysis had opened a door that could not be closed. The impossible woman was real, but she was not Raney O'Brien. Someone in the government had created an elaborate system that allowed a single person to appear in multiple locations simultaneously while using the identity of a dead woman. The question now was whether this was part of something larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Professor David Walsh, a military historian specializing in World War I intelligence operations, was brought in to investigate the government connection that Dr. Torres had discovered. His research into classified documents would reveal the true story behind the Impossible Woman and expose one of the most secret programs in American wartime history. Professor Walsh gained access to recently declassified documents from the National Archives that had been sealed for over a century. Among these files, he discovered references to Operation Harvest Watch, a covert surveillance program that had been created by the War Department in 1916 to monitor potential German sympathizers among American agricultural workers. The program was established in response to intelligence reports suggesting that German agents were attempting to infiltrate America's food production system. The concern was that sabotage of farms and food processing facilities could create shortages that would undermine the American war effort and civilian morale. Operation Harvest Watch used female agents who were trained to assume multiple identities and travel rapidly between agricultural locations to observe and report on suspicious activities. The program deliberately recruited women because they could blend in with the Women's Land Army workers without drawing attention from potential German operatives. Professor Walsh found personnel files that revealed the true identity of the mysterious woman. Her real name was Catherine Mills, and she was a professional intelligence operative who had been trained in surveillance techniques, document forgery, and rapid travel methods. She was 28 years old and had previously worked for the Secret Service before being recruited for the agricultural surveillance program. The decision to use Raney O'Brien's identity was made by program administrators who needed untraceable cover stories for their agents. They systematically identified women who had recently died in industrial accidents or other tragedies, then created new identity documents that would allow agents to assume these identities without raising suspicion. Catherine Mills was given Raney O'Brien's identity, along with a complete background story that included family history, work experience, and personal details that would allow her to maintain the cover identity under questioning. The program had access to military transportation networks that allowed agents to travel between locations much faster than civilian methods would permit. Dr. Walsh discovered that Catherine Mills had been extraordinarily effective in her undercover work. Over the course of 2 years, she had successfully identified and reported on 3 separate networks of German sympathizers who were attempting to disrupt American agricultural production. The first network was operating in the Midwest, where German immigrants were being recruited to sabotage grain storage facilities. Mills discovered the operation while working undercover at a wheat processing plant in Kansas. Her reports led to the arrest of 12 individuals and prevented significant damage to the grain supply. The second network was focused on livestock, with agents attempting to spread diseases among cattle herds in Texas and Oklahoma. Mills identified the operation while working at a dairy farm and provided information that allowed authorities to stop the spread of a deliberately introduced cattle disease. The third network was the most sophisticated, involving attempts to poison fruit crops in California and Washington state. Mills discovered this operation while working in an apple orchard and provided crucial intelligence that led to the arrest of German agents who had been posing as agricultural inspectors. Professor Walsh found testimony from Mills's granddaughter, who had been told family stories about her grandmother's secret war work. The granddaughter, now in her 80s, remembered her grandmother talking about traveling constantly during the war and having to remember multiple names and life stories. The program files showed that over 200 deceased women's identities were used by Operation Harvest Watch agents during the war. The system was so effective that it continued to operate until 1919, when the end of the war made the surveillance program unnecessary. Catherine Mills's success in identifying German spy networks earned her recognition within the intelligence community. But the classified nature of her work meant that she could never receive public acknowledgement. The promotional materials featuring her image were the government's way of honoring her service while maintaining the secrecy of the operation. The program was disbanded after the war, and most records were destroyed to protect the identities of the agents who had participated. The few surviving documents were classified at the highest levels and only became available to researchers in recent years. Professor Walsh's investigation revealed that Operation Harvest Watch was considered one of the most successful intelligence operations of World War I. The program prevented significant damage to American food production and identified dozens of German agents who were operating within the United States. Catherine Mills continued to work for the government after the war, but her subsequent assignments were even more highly classified. She eventually retired from intelligence work in 1925 and lived quietly until her death in 1967. Her family was never told the full extent of her wartime service. The use of dead women's identities raised ethical questions that were debated within the War Department at the time. Some officials argued that using the identities of deceased persons was disrespectful to their memory and their families. Others maintained that the practice was necessary for national security and that the women's identities were serving their country even after death. The program's success in protecting American agriculture during a critical time in the war was considered to justify the controversial methods used. The intelligence gathered by agents like Catherine Mills helped ensure that American food production remained secure throughout the conflict. The photograph of the Impossible Woman now tells a completely different story than it did when this investigation began. What looked like a simple image of Women's Land Army workers parading through New York City is actually a document of one of the most secret and successful intelligence operations in American history. Raney O'Brien's tragic death in the factory fire ended up serving her country in ways she never could have imagined. Her identity became a shield that protected Agent Catherine Mills as she carried out dangerous undercover work to keep America's food supply safe during World War I. Catherine Mills's courage and skill in assuming multiple identities and traveling across the country to identify German spy networks represents a form of heroism that remained hidden for over a century. Her ability to blend in with agricultural workers while conducting sophisticated intelligence operations required exceptional training and personal courage. The moral complexity of using dead women's identities for national security purposes raises questions that remain relevant today. Was it justified to use Raney O'Brien's identity without her consent or her family's knowledge? The program's success in preventing sabotage and protecting American lives suggests that wartime necessities sometimes require difficult ethical choices. The photograph shows us that historical images often contain layers of meaning that are not easy to see at first glance. The woman driving the wagon in that New York City parade was not just an agricultural worker but a trained intelligence operative whose work helped protect the entire American food system. This investigation shows us how modern technology can help us find hidden stories from the past. Without facial recognition software and DNA analysis, the true story of Catherine Mills and Operation Harvest Watch might never have been discovered. The combination of old-fashioned historical research with new scientific methods continues to help us understand new parts of our past. The work of both Raney O'Brien and Catherine Mills represents different forms of service to their country. Raney's identity, saved after her early death, became a tool for protecting American security. Catherine's willingness to take on that identity and risk her life in undercover operations helped make sure that America's involvement in World War I was not damaged by enemy sabotage. Do you have family photographs that might contain hidden stories? Historical images often hold secrets that can only be revealed through careful investigation and modern analysis. The seemingly ordinary photograph of a woman working in a field turned out to document one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations in American history. Consider looking more closely at the historical images in your own family collection. That simple photograph of a relative in a parade or at work might actually document a much more complex and fascinating story than you ever imagined.
If you haven't subscribed yet, you might never see this channel again. So make sure you're subscribed and get more videos like this.